Hi, sophomores. We're going to do chapter 14, section 3, 4, and 5 to finish up the chapter on the Renaissance and Reformation. Section 3 and 4 and 5 are on the Reformation. So that's where we're at. So here we go. Chapter 14, section 3, Protestant Reformation. So what happens where it's how we get the Lutheran denomination, it's how we get the Baptist denominations, how we get the Church of England or the Anglican Church. So that's kind of what we're going into. Corruption in the Catholic Church during the Renaissance. If you go back, we did skip the chapter on Greeks and the Romans, and of course the start of Christianity. The first church in Christianity, early Christianity, was the Roman Catholic Church, but you'll have a split away from the church starting in this time period. So that's what we're doing. So corruption in the Catholic Church during the Renaissance. This reform movement is known as the Protestant Reformation, protesting, and in particular protesting the corruption in the church at the time. Abuses taking place in the church. The church, as they got wealthier and more powerful, they get caught up in worldly affairs. Popes competed with Italian princes for political power. You have a theocracy. You don't have separation of church and state like we do today in the United States. They're together. So political power is also held by the popes. Popes during the Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth of learning. Rebirth of learning is going to start in Italy. They're going to live a very lavish lifestyle, and they're going to get away from the early teachings, or the original teachings of the church. Leo X, he was son of Lorenzo the Beneficent. He was elected pope, and his comment was, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." So he did enjoy the lavish lifestyle that he was living. Spent vast sums to rebuild the Cathedral of St. Peter's in Rome. To finance such projects, the church had to increase fees. So it's not the way it is today in the church, but this is what they were doing then. Let's see if I get this to go. There we go. So because they're spending a lot of money on these churches, they need to pay for it. And you can do that through, donations, your tithings. When you go to church, you put money in the basket. That's your tithing. But they need more than that. So the church is going to increase fees. So they're going to charge fees for services, like a fee to get married, a fee to be baptized, a fee when you go to reconciliation or confession. It's not the way it is today, and it wasn't the way it was when it started, but that's what they're going to start doing during this time period, late 1400s, early 1500s. They're going to promote the sale of indulgences, which is basically pardon for sins committed during a person's lifetime. And so you can pay to have your sins forgiven. So if you have the money, you can pay for it, not do anything, not change your lifestyle. And that's going to be a huge issue for Martin Luther. And that's going to lead to Luther's protest. Now, Martin Luther was a middle-class Catholic monk. In 1517 AD, protests erupted into a full-scale revolt. It was triggered by a German monk, Martin Luther. He was also a professor of theology. He came from a middle-class family. He had a career as a lawyer. Disappointed his mother because his mother wanted him to be a lawyer. Instead, he enters the monastery. While in the monastery, he's seeing these increased fees, and in particular, the selling of indulgences, which is going to make him mad. He wants to air out his grievances, and he's going to attack the indulgences. So in 1517, indulgences are being sold to help pay to build the church, to build the cathedral of St. Peter in Rome. This made Martin Luther furious. He said you should seek true repentance. You shouldn't just pay to have your sins forgiven and then just go on. So in those days, you had to remember this is what was practiced in those days. If you had an issue, you would write your issue on a piece of paper and you would hammer it typically on the door of a church or in a location where people would come and they'd read it and make comments. Printing press is just starting up at this time. So the 95 Thesis was a list of arguments against sale of indulgences. So he posted it on the door of the Wittenberg's All Saints Church. and it's kind of like a bulletin board for people to come make comments. So that's what he does. He goes in and he does that, puts it on the thing, but printing press is going on or are coming into play around this time period. Someone's going to remove that from the door of the Wittenberg's church and going to mass produce it. So kind of a small conversation ends up turning into a major revolt. Martin Luther versus the church. Church wanted Luther to recant or to give up his views, to take back what he said. And he says, I'm not going to do that. In 1521, then the Pope's going to excommunicate him. If you're in this time, it's just the Catholic Church. Christianity, excommunication means you cannot receive the sacraments. So that's huge. So the Pope at the time is going to excommunicate him. Luther was declared an outlaw, making it a crime for anyone in the empire to give him food or shelter. But he'll have a buddy in Prince Frederick of Saxony. Prince Frederick will hide Martin Luther in his castle in Württemberg, and he'll hide him there for about a year. Luther's teachings, so that's where we get the break. So Martin Luther, he will break from the Catholic Church. He'll be kind of hunted down. He'll be excommunicated from the church, and he eventually lead to the start of the Lutheran, if you are a Lutheran, of Lutheran denomination. And what's the difference between Lutheran denomination and the Catholic denomination of Christianity? Salvation could be achieved through faith alone. The Bible was sole source of religious truth. He rejected the idea that priests and church hierarchy had special powers. He actually took the Bible, which was in Latin, and translated it into the German vernacular, which means more people could read it. He rejected 5 of the 7 sacraments. So the biggest difference in regards to Catholics and Lutherans today is that Catholics have 7 sacraments, Lutherans have 2 sacraments. So Martin Luther's going to reject 5 of the 7 because he's saying the Bible doesn't word for word specifically mention them. They talk about them, but not specifically. And I don't remember the exact, the 2. I'll have to think about that. But in the Catholic denomination, you have the sacrament of marriage, baptism, holy orders, matrimony, reconciliation, last rites. I say last rites. I'm missing one. Confirmation. And Lutherans have 2 sacraments. So that's the difference. He banned indulgences, he banned confessions, he banned pilgrimages, and he banned prayers to the saints. He abolished the elaborate ritual of the Catholic Mass and instead emphasized the sermon. And he also, big difference between Lutherans and Catholics, is he permitted clergy to marry. Because priests and nuns, of course, in the Catholic Church do not marry. The spread, how does Martin Luther spread his ideas? How does it end up spreading? By 1530, Lutherans were using a name, the new name Protestant, means to protest, for all those who protested papal authority. There's widespread support at the time and an answer to corruption in the church. However, as this kind of branches out, there's going to be some selfish reasons for that. So it's not 100% non-selfish. 1524, peasants' revolt erupted across Germany. This is kind of during the time of the Middle Ages and serfdom, and so they're demanding an end to serfdom, other changes, harsh lives, and they thought Luther would be on board with them, and instead he denounces it. He urged nobles to suppress the rebellion. 70,000 to 100,000 peasants are killed, 50,000 are homeless, and so it ended up being kind of disappointing to those individuals that Martin Luther did not support them. The Peace of Augsburg, that was signed in 1555, allowed each prince to decide which religion, Catholic or Lutheran, would be followed in his land. So that's when you start seeing leaders, because you have a theocracy, you don't have separation of church and state. You'll see northern German states tend to be the denomination of Lutheranism, and the southern German states tended to be Catholic. And so if the leader was Catholic, everybody's Catholic. If the leader's Lutheran, everybody's Lutheran. It's not the way it is in the United States today, of course, but John Calvin, and there's going to be some other movements. John Calvin, the most important reformer to follow Martin Luther, was John Calvin. So then you're going to have another split, and another split, and another split. So the initial Christianity, the initial church is the Catholic Church. Martin Luther's going to break away and start Lutheranism, or the Lutheran denomination, and then you're going to have splits after that. Teachings, John Calvin was born in France. He was trained as a priest and a lawyer, believed that salvation was gained through faith alone. The Bible is the only source of religious truth. God was all-powerful, and that humans were by nature sinful. Big difference between Calvin and Martin Luther in particular is Calvin tended to be pessimistic, not very optimistic. He was, we're sinners, we're bad people by nature, according to John Calvin. Also, big difference is John Calvin believed in predestination. The idea that God had long determined who would gain salvation. So who's going to go to heaven, who's going to go to hell, who are going to be saints, who are going to be sinners. And of course, that wasn't what the Catholic denomination or the Lutheran denomination believed. Calvin's Geneva in 1541, Geneva, Switzerland, is eventually where Calvin will lead his religious community. It's a theocracy. It's a government run by church leaders. Today in the United States, we don't have a theocracy. We have separation of church and state. The only true theocracy in the world today is in Iran. The Iranian government is led by Muslim leaders. That's the only true theocracy today. Calvin's movement, they're going to stress hard work, discipline, thrift, honesty, morality, believed in religious education for girls as well as boys. And then the spread of Calvinism, reformers from all over Europe visited Geneva, Switzerland, and then would take their ideas of Calvin home. Okay, so that's the initial split. So we're going to go from early Christianity to Catholic Church, then to the Lutheran denomination, then to the Calvin movement via John Calvin. Section 4 is going to go into another split. Okay, so Reformation means to reform. Protestant means to protest, and they're protesting at the time the power of and worldliness of the Catholic Church. All right, Section 4. Reformation ideas spread. Henry III, and then we'll get to Henry VIII. Henry VIII is an interesting guy. Henry III, he was a Catholic king of France. Remember, if you're the leader of a country, you determine whether a country is going to be Catholic or Protestant. Henry III is Catholic, and he's the king of France. And he was deeply disturbed by the Calvinist movement, John Calvin, and the reformers in Geneva. So you're going to start seeing Catholics fighting back. They're going to fight back against Protestant challenges, and they can do that by saying, we don't have problems, we're not going to fix it, or we need to make some reform within the church. So Henry III will be one of the first Catholic kings to take steps to reform or to fix the problems in the church. Radical reformers, other groups that are going to split away, you're going to have the Anabaptists. They're going to reject infant baptism. So you have the initial split is Martin Luther, then you have John Calvin, then eventually you'll have the Anabaptists. Anabaptists believe in baptism when you're older. So those of you that are of the Baptist denomination, you're baptized when you're older. So Anabaptists reject infant baptism. Peaceful women and men, they called for religious toleration. They called for separation of church and state, which is what we have today in America. And the Anabaptists, there'll be splits from the Anabaptists. There'll be the Baptists, the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Amish, would be some examples. And then some of those will split. For example, like the Lutheran denomination will also split. So it's kind of how we ended up where we're at today. The English Reformation, John Wycliffe, he was a religious leader. He called for the church to reform as early as the 1300s. So, and that's pretty brave. The church is very powerful in the 1300s. And he's kind of sticking his neck out a little bit by challenging the church and saying the church needs to get its house in order. And so he was taking a risk by doing that. 95 Thesis is a list of arguments against the sale of indulgences. Oops, where am I going here? Is this a repeat? Sorry, guys. Looks like this repeated. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Sorry. So just understand that what happens in the 1517 with the 95 Thesis, actually there were concerns clear back in the 1300s. Seeking an annulment. Okay, so this is how we get the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Henry VIII, he stood firm against the Protestant revolt, and he denounced Luther. So Henry VIII was a diehard Catholic, I guess, until he is at odds with the church. In 1527, go back, remember 1517 is when the 95 Thesis was posted on the Wittenberg Church. This is 1527, 10 years later. Henry VIII, so he's after Luther, he's supporting the Catholic Church. Things are going to change, though. In 1527, Henry VIII is at odds with the church. He's married to a woman by the name of Catherine of Aragon. He marries her. He's been married to her for 18 years. She was at one time married to his brother Arthur. She's married to Arthur for about a year. He dies, and Henry will marry her. They are married for 18 years, and they have no male heirs. They only have a surviving daughter. Her name is Mary Tudor. Later on, she'll be known as Bloody Mary. Henry was obsessed with having a male heir. He felt that England's stability depended on his having a male heir to succeed him. And right now he only has, several children, several miscarriages, but right now he has one daughter, and her name is Mary. And so he assumes the problem is Catherine. So he wants to divorce Catherine. Church law does not permit divorce because marriage is a sacrament in the Catholic Church. And so he went to the Pope and asked the Pope to annul or to cancel his marriage, or to say the marriage never occurred between he and Catherine. But Catherine had connections to the Pope, and which we'll get into here. And so the annulment is not granted. Break with Rome. Popes had freed rulers from marriages before. It was not uncommon for rulers to go to popes and say, hey, I want annulment, and for them to get those granted. The current pope did not want to offend the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles V was a nephew to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is Henry VIII's first wife of 18 years. So he refuses to annul the marriage, which makes Henry VIII upset. Because Henry VIII he already has a new lady. He wants to marry her and try to have a male heir. So Henry VIII is upset. It would stir up the English feelings against the Pope. Henry VIII would take over. Eventually, will get upset, and he'll become kind of the head of the church, take over the English church. Church placed in Henry's rule. So a lot of things happen in your book, skipping a lot of the details, but I'll give you kind of a short version. Henry VIII now remember, he wants an annulment in 1527. The annulment is not granted. In 1534, he passes what is called the Act of Supremacy, and that basically makes Henry VIII, the King of England, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. And so he's going to appoint Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop, and he will then ask Cranmer to annul the marriage. Now, before this all happens, the Act of Supremacy, Sir Thomas More would not sign the papers. And we'll talk about him later, but would not sign the papers to have the Act of Supremacy go through. So eventually Sir Thomas More is beheaded, and eventually the Act of Supremacy will go through. He'll become head of the church, and Cranmer will annul the marriage. So Henry VIII will get what he wants. So he will then remarry Anne Boleyn, who's already pregnant with Henry's child, and she, I guess unfortunately for Henry VIII, bears him a daughter by the name of Elizabeth. And she will have several miscarriages after that and will never produce a son. So he will eventually marry 4 more times. Of those 6 marriages, 2 of his wives will be beheaded. Eventually, with his third wife, he'll have a son. Her name was Jane Seymour, and the son will be named Edward. And Edward will die relatively young. The Church of England between 1536 and 1540, Henry VIII will shut down all the convents, all the monasteries in England. He'll take all church property, and that will now belong to Henry VIII and England. And he will start what's known as the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. Church of England kept a lot of the same things that the Catholic Church was doing. He kept most Catholic forms of worship, and he kept the English Bible. Eventually, 1547, Henry VIII will die. So out of all those marriages, he'll really only have 3 surviving heirs: Bloody Mary, or Mary Tudor, Queen Elizabeth, or Elizabeth, and then the son Edward. And Edward will not live very long. He'll die in his teenage years. And 2 wives will be beheaded. Edward VI, 10-year-old son, he will inherit the throne. Henry will die in 1547. So I guess going back, that's 20 years after, I guess, the initial request to have his marriage annulled. Oops. There's my cursor. So religious turmoil will sweep England. Edward will die in his teens. There's speculation that possibly he was poisoned. He died a very terrible death, and most possibly he was poisoned. Mary Tudor, so then you have Mary and you have Elizabeth. Mary Tudor, his half-sister, she will inherit the throne. She's a very pious Catholic, and she's determined to make England Catholic again, but she does it very violently. Hundreds of Protestants will die. A lot of them will be burned to the stake, and she will not allow them to recant. And so that's how she got the nickname Bloody Mary. So she did fail to make England a Catholic nation again. Elizabeth, her half-sister, she was a daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. She will become queen, and she's very popular. And she will establish England as a Protestant land, but she's tolerant of Catholics as well. Elizabeth restores unity to England. Mary is not popular. She's Catholic, and part of that is because she took away the process or allowing people to recant. A lot of Protestants were killed during this time period, and she will even imprison her own stepsister, or half-sister, I guess, in the Tower of England, Tower of London. Elizabeth was very popular. She was Protestant, and she was tolerant of all religions. Mary, she's jealous of Elizabeth. Mary will take Elizabeth. She'll imprison Elizabeth in the Tower of London. In 1554, Mary had Elizabeth arrested and imprisoned. She was held there for 2 months. Elizabeth just knew that probably what would happen, she'd be beheaded. That's what happened to her mother, Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn had been placed or imprisoned in the Tower of London as well, had gone to her death from the tower and other innocent victims. Soldiers were ordered to remove Elizabeth to the Queen's Manor. So when the soldiers come to get her out of the tower, she thinks they're getting her to behead her. Instead, she is taken to a manor house in a distant town called Woodstock, and she'll be imprisoned there for a year, and that's going to make her more popular with people. Oops. Sorry, guys. I don't know what's happening there. Mary kept Elizabeth at Woodstock for nearly a year, finally allowed to return to court. In 1558, Mary's going to die. She'll actually marry, I think, a distant cousin. I don't remember. She will die, and think of cancer. She has some type of cancer, I believe, and she'll die. Mary will die in 1558. A policy of religious compromise. Elizabeth is going to take the throne. She'll adopt a policy of religious compromise. Under Elizabeth, English replaced Latin as the language of the Anglican Church. Catholic Church hierarchy of bishops and archbishops was kept. Elizabeth preserved many traditional Catholic ideas, even though she's Protestant. But England was, under Elizabeth, a Protestant nation. And the Catholic Reformation. Catholic Reformation was headed by Pope Paul III in 1530s, 1540s, and there was a revival of moral authority. So we're going to reform changes made in the church. It's going to start within. The Council of Trent in 1545, the council reaffirmed traditional Catholic views. Salvation comes through faith and good works. The council took steps to end abuses in the church, penalties for worldliness and corruption among the clergy. They're going to establish new schools. They're going to better educate clergy. So that's the movement within the church. The Inquisition, Pope Paul III is going to strengthen the Catholic Inquisition. Inquisition was a church court set up to root out heresies, secret testimony, torture, execution to stamp out heresy. Index. A lot of religions have what's called an index. That's a forbidden books, a list of works considered too immoral or irreligious for Catholics to read. So the Catholic Index would have books by Luther, books by John Calvin. Different denominations also have indexes. Ignatius of Loyola, Society of Jesus or Jesuits, he founded, by Ignatius of Loyola, he founded the Jesuits. I think Creighton Universities, is that right? I think Creighton University is a Jesuit university. Rockhurst in Kansas City is a Jesuit university, and that's Society of Jesus. Was determined to combat heresy and spread the Catholic faith. Strict program for the Jesuits, rigorous religious training, absolute obedience to the church, and spiritual and moral discipline. So that's an attempt to reform the church, and and they tended to focus on education. Saint Teresa of Avila, I don't know if I'm saying that right. A daughter of a well-to-do Spanish noble family, she set up her own order of Carmelite nuns. So Saint Teresa founded the Carmelite nuns. They lived in isolation, eating and sleeping very little, dedicating themselves to prayer and meditation. She was asked to reorganize and reform convents and monasteries throughout Spain. Eventually, Saint Teresa, of course, would become a saint. Results, the reforms did stop the Protestant tide and even returned some areas to the Catholic Church. Still remained divided. Catholics tended to dominate the South. Protestants tended to dominate the North. And then widespread persecution. Persecution widespread. The Inquisition executed many people accused of heresy. Protestants killed Catholics, Catholic priests, and destroyed Catholic churches. Both Catholics and Protestants persecuted Anabaptists. If you remember with Mr. Mirage, you studied about the Salem witchcraft and the witch hunts. Those will start in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. Witch hunts, a wave of witch hunting, those accused typically of being witches and persecuted by whether it be the Protestant denominations or the Catholic Church, usually are women, usually in their middle-aged women. 1450 to 1500, tens of thousands of women and men died in these witch hunting craves. People looked for scapegoats in troubled times. So they usually would target beggars, widows, midwives, herbalists, were usually the ones that were targeted. And Jews were targeted throughout history. Jews in the Reformation. Reformation brought hard times to Europe's Jews. Pressure strong on Jews to convert to Christianity. 1516, Jews in Venice had to live in separate quarters of the city known as the ghetto. So remember World War II, Holocaust. The ghetto was not invented by Adolf Hitler. Ghettos had been around way before that. During the Reformation, restrictions on Jews increased. Some German princes were expelled. All German states confined Jews to ghettos. In the 1500s, they had to wear the yellow badge if they traveled outside the ghetto, just like what Adolf Hitler was doing during World War II. 1550s, Pope Paul IV, he restricted Jewish activity. Charles V banned the migration of Jews to his colonies and the Americans, and after 1550, many Jews migrated to Poland and Lithuania. So going back to the section 2 on the bubonic plague, the Jews were blamed for that. So a lot of times anything that happened, anything happening in the world, typically Jews were the scapegoats. I failed to mention that when I was lecturing over section 2. All right, last thing. Section 5 is just on the science and science contradicting the church. Scientific revolution, also in the 1500s. So you have the Renaissance that's going to start in the 1300s to the 1500s. You're going to have Reformation that's going to start early 1500s to the end of the 1500s, and then the scientific revolution, which is going to start in the 1500s. A revolutionary theory. 1543, Polish scholar Nicholas Copernicus. He's going to publish a book called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. Basically, the concept is heliocentric, sun-centered. Sun's the center of the universe, and the planets revolve around the sun. The sun stood at the center of the universe. The Earth was just one of several planets that revolved around the sun. Many experts rejected this theory, and that statement was also contradicting this teachings of the church. It contradicted church teaching and the teachings of Ptolemy, both of which the church and Ptolemy were wrong. Tycho Brahe, I might be saying that wrong, you guys, sorry. Danish astronomer provided evidence that supported Copernicus' theory. So you're going to start having scientists saying, yeah, I think Copernicus is right. Johann Kepler, he was a German astronomer and mathematician. He used Brahe's data to calculate the orbits of the planets revolving around the sun. Same thing, Kepler's going to support Copernicus. It does not move. Many scientists built on the foundation laid by Copernicus it does move. Many scientists built on the foundations laid by Copernicus and Kepler. Galileo Galilei, he used technology developed by a Dutch lens grinder to assemble an astronomical telescope. He was the first person to see the mountains on the moon, first person to see sunspots. He also observed the 4 moons of Jupiter. Galileo's discoveries are going to cause an uproar, in particular with the church. The church condemned him because his ideas challenged the Christian teachings that the heavens were fixed, unmoving, and perfect. In 1633, so now we're getting to the 1600s, Galileo was brought to trial before the Inquisition. He was threatened with death unless he recanted what he believed and withdrew his so-called heresies. And he does that to avoid death. New scientific method. By the early 1600s, a new approach to science had emerged, observation, experimentation. So I know Mrs. Kirshner probably goes through this. Mr. O'Malley talks about observation, experimentation, probably also had it with Mr. Mraz, Mr. Gunderson. So that's going to come around in the 1600s. Isaac Newton, gravity, right? He showed that a single force keeps planets in their orbits around the sun, called gravity. More scientific advances. Most important breakthroughs were those that occurred in chemistry and medicine. Chemistry is going to start getting away from magical notions. A person by the name of Robert Boyle is going to distinguish between individual elements and chemical compounds. Also is going to explain the effect of temperature and pressure on gases. Medicine's going to change. Galen, he was a medieval, medieval physician, relied on ancient works of Galen and found out that Galen had a lot of errors in regards to his knowledge. Andreas Vesalius, first accurate and detailed study of the human anatomy. Ambrose Parr, he was a French physician, developed a new and more effective ointment for preventing infection. He also developed a technique for closing wounds with stitches. William Harvey, he's going to describe the circulation of the blood for the first time. And then Bacon and Descartes, both are going to reject Aristotle's scientific assumptions. They're going to challenge the church. You're just going to start seeing science contradicting early beliefs of the church. Bacon stressed experiment and observation. Descartes is going to emphasize human reasoning as the best road to understanding. And I think that's it, guys. So I will. I think we'll be starting section 2. We're getting ready for section 2. Section 3, 4, and 5 is on the Reformation. Hope everybody's doing well. Miss you guys.